back to our discussion.
Between the years 300 and 900 AD, the region we now know as Belize was the heartbeat of the Maya Classic period. This was an era of unprecedented growth and sophistication, where the landscape was transformed by a population estimated at 1 to 2 million people. To put that in perspective, that is nearly 4 times the population of modern-day Belize, inhabiting the same amount of land. During this golden age, the Maya did not operate under a single central government or a lone capital city. Instead, they organized themselves into a series of powerful, independent city-states.
Prominent sites like Caracol, Sunantanich, Lamanai, and El Pilar each functioned as their own autonomous political centers, with their own rulers and unique identities. As these cities flourished, the physical environment changed dramatically to accommodate urban expansion. The Maya were masterful architects and engineers, constructing towering stone temples and expansive residential areas that rose out of the jungle. This growth was not just about size, it was about scientific precision. One of the most fascinating aspects of Maya urban planning was its deep connection to the cosmos.
The Maya developed advanced systems of astrology and mathematics to track the movements of the sun and planets, particularly Venus. Visitors to these ancient sites today can still see evidence of this in what archaeologists call E-groups. These were specific architectural arrangements designed to function as astronomical observatories. By aligning buildings with the rising sun during solstices and equinoxes, the Maya created highly accurate calendars that dictated their agricultural cycles and ceremonial lives. To maintain the flow of people, goods, and ideas between these bustling centers, the Maya engineered an impressive network of roads known as sakbeab, or causeways. In the Maya language, sakbe literally means white way, referencing the white limestone plaster used to pave them, which would have glowed under the moonlight. These were not merely paths through the jungle. They were sophisticated pieces of infrastructure, sometimes raised several feet above the ground, that linked one city to another. They served multiple purposes, ranging from practical trade and communication routes to grand stages for ceremonial processions led by the elite class.
The sakbe allowed the various city-states to remain interconnected despite the rugged terrain and their separate political structures. Beyond the physical roads, the Maya also built intellectual pathways. The Classic period saw the peak of their complex writing systems and the recording of history through stelae, tall stone monuments that celebrated the power and lineage of their kings. This era was characterized by a vibrant exchange of ideas and a shared culture that united millions of people across the Mesoamerican region. Through the construction of magnificent cities, the mastery of the stars, and the engineering of a vast roadway system, the Maya of the Classic period established a civilization that remains one of the most remarkable in human history. During the Maya Classic period, between 300 and 900 AD, the civilization did not simply grow in isolation. One of the most critical drivers of their success and prosperity was the establishment of extensive trade links that stretched across the Mesoamerican region, connecting the cities of modern-day Belize with powerful neighbors in Mexico and Guatemala. This was not just a local exchange of basic necessities, it was a sophisticated and far-reaching economic system that defined the golden age of the Maya. To facilitate this movement, the Maya constructed an impressive network of roads known as sakbe. In the Maya language, sakbe means white way, referring to the limestone plaster that made them glow. These roads, or causeways, served multiple purposes, from hosting ceremonial walks for the elite to allowing the rapid movement of goods and people between city-states. Perhaps the most striking piece of evidence for the reach and wealth of these trade networks is the famous jade head discovered at the archaeological site of Altun Ha. This artifact is a masterpiece of craftsmanship and remains the largest carved jade object ever found within the Maya world. It weighs approximately 9¼ pounds and is roughly the size of a human head. The carving represents Kinich Ahau, the Maya sun god, and it is a central symbol of Belizean heritage today. Finding such a massive and beautifully worked piece of jade at a site like Altun Ha tells us that this city was a major player in the regional economy. However, the real historical significance of the jade head goes beyond its religious meaning or its physical beauty. The true value of the find lies in what it reveals about Maya commerce. If you were to examine the geology of Belize, you would find that jade does not naturally occur there. It is simply not part of the country's mineral landscape. The closest source for this precious stone is the Motagua Valley in Guatemala. This geological reality leads us to a profound conclusion. The jade used to create the head at Altunha had to have been transported over hundreds of miles of difficult terrain. This proves that the Maya were trading on a massive scale.
Their coastal and inland sites were hubs for maritime and land-based commerce, exchanging local resources for rare materials. When we consider that the population of the region during this time is estimated to have been between 1 and 2 million people, the necessity for such trade becomes clear. The presence of the jade head at Altunha is a permanent record of a civilization that was deeply interconnected, demonstrating that their economic reach was as expansive as their legendary knowledge of astrology and mathematics. Imagine a time when the land we now know as Belize was home to between 1 and 2 million people. To put that in perspective, that is more than double the country's current population today. During the height of the classic Maya period, from 300 to 900 AD, this massive population required an incredible amount of food, which led to a dramatic and eventually catastrophic transformation of the landscape. The primary method used to sustain these flourishing cities was slash-and-burn agriculture. Farmers would cut down sections of the forest during the dry season, allow the vegetation to dry, and then burn it to create nutrient-rich ash for planting once the rains arrived. While this worked for smaller, nomadic groups, the sheer scale of the Maya civilization turned this practice into an environmental crisis. To feed millions, the Maya had to clear vast stretches of lush jungle, stripping the land of its natural protection. This widespread deforestation had a devastating side effect on the local climate. As the trees disappeared, so did the vital process of transpiration. Without the dense canopy to release moisture back into the atmosphere, the cycle of evaporation and rainfall was severely disrupted.
The once reliable rainy seasons began to fail, and the region was gripped by prolonged, severe droughts. We can see the importance of this forest cover even today by looking at the modern geography of Belize. In the north, where there is less dense jungle, the area receives roughly 50 to 70 inches of rain per year. In contrast, the lush, mountainous south can receive up to 170 inches. When the ancient Maya cleared their forests, they were essentially turning off their own water supply. This environmental collapse put an unbearable strain on the social and political fabric of the civilization.
The Maya people were deeply spiritual and depended on their leaders to mediate with the heavens. The elites lived in grand temples and claimed they could speak directly to deities like Chak, the god of rain, to ensure successful harvests. However, as the droughts worsened and the corn withered in the fields, the peasantry began to realize that the elite could not actually control the elements. The people were hungry, and they began to question why they were laboring for a leadership that could no longer provide the most basic necessity for survival: water.
The lack of rainfall meant no cultivation, and no cultivation meant total social breakdown. This ecological mismanagement created a domino effect, leading to malnutrition, internal warfare over dwindling resources, and a complete loss of faith in the ruling class. Ultimately, the environmental damage caused by over-farming and deforestation made the great city-states unsustainable, forcing the population to abandon their magnificent stone monuments in search of survival elsewhere. While the classic period represented the height of Maya achievement, the civilization eventually faced a period of profound instability that led to its collapse. To understand this downfall, we have to look at the immense pressure placed on the land and the people. At its peak, the population in what we now call Belize was estimated to be between 1 and 2 million people. For perspective, that is more than double the population of the country today. Supporting such a massive number of people required intensive agricultural practices, specifically the slash-and-burn method.
This involved clearing vast stretches of jungle during the dry season to make room for crops. The scale of this deforestation triggered a devastating environmental chain reaction. Without the lush canopy of the trees to facilitate transpiration and evaporation, the natural cycle of rainfall was broken. This led to prolonged, severe droughts. In the northern regions, which lacked the mountains and heavy rainfall of the south, the situation became desperate. As the land dried up and crops failed, the fundamental relationship between the Maya elite and the peasantry began to fracture.
Maya society was built on a strict hierarchy, where the elite lived in grand ceremonial centers like Karakal and Sunantunich. These rulers were not just political leaders, they were seen as divine intermediaries who could communicate with gods like Chak, the god of rain. The peasantry provided the labor and the food that sustained the ruling class, and in exchange, the elite promised to maintain the cosmic order and ensure the rain would fall. When the drought persisted year after year, it became clear to the common people that the leadership had failed.
The rituals performed in the high temples were no longer working, and the peasants began to feel that they were being misled by a leadership that could not deliver on its most basic promises. This loss of faith sparked widespread social unrest and political failure. We see evidence of this tension in the archaeological record, where walls were constructed to separate the elite residential areas from the rest of the city, suggesting that the rulers were increasingly fearful of their own subjects. The alliance systems that once linked different city-states began to crumble, replaced by intense rivalries and warfare as leaders fought over dwindling resources. By approximately 900 AD, the period known as the Terminal Classic was well underway, and the general collapse of the civilization was inevitable. Around the year 1000 AD, the majority of the great stone cities were abandoned. This was not a sudden disappearance of the people themselves, but rather a rejection of the failed political system. The Maya did not vanish, they moved into the bush, forming smaller, more sustainable family communities away from the decaying city centers. While cities like Lamanai managed to survive, the sophisticated systems of astrology, mathematics, and writing that had been developed by the elite were largely left behind in the ruins of the abandoned cities. The transition from the ancient Maya world to European contact began in 1502, when Christopher Columbus sailed into what we now call the Bay of Honduras during his fourth and final voyage. Although he navigated these coastal waters, the Spanish did not immediately establish permanent settlements in the area. Instead, the early 1500s were characterized by accidental arrivals and failed attempts at conquest. A significant moment occurred in 1511 when a small group of Spanish sailors was shipwrecked along the southern Yucatan coast, near the borders of modern-day Belize.
This brought the Spanish into direct contact with the resilient Maya people, but these early encounters were often marked by conflict rather than cooperation. As the 16th century progressed, the Spanish intensified their efforts to subdue the Yucatan and surrounding territories. By 1570, they attempted to exert religious and political influence by establishing a Christian church at the Maya site of Lamanai. However, the Maya were not easily conquered. They fiercely resisted Spanish subjugation, and the area remained incredibly volatile. The Maya eventually burned down the church at Lamanai, signaling a clear rejection of European authority. Because the Spanish found the swampy, mosquito-infested terrain of the Belizean coast difficult to manage and lacking in obvious gold or silver, they largely left the region unsettled, focusing their attention instead on Mexico and Guatemala. This geographical neglect created a perfect vacuum for other Europeans to fill. During the 1600s, the coast of Belize became a strategic refuge for buccaneers and privateers. These sailors used the intricate network of cays and the Great Barrier Reef to hide from Spanish treasure ships and plunder their cargo. Eventually, some of these sailors began to transition from piracy to more permanent activities. The first recorded British settlement was established in 1638 by a group of shipwrecked sailors. These early settlers became known as the Baymen. The Baymen discovered that the forests were rich in logwood, a valuable tree used to produce a highly sought-after textile dye. This dye created a deep maroon or purple color that was in high demand in the European garment industry. Life for these early British settlers was incredibly harsh.
They lived in remote camps deep within the swamps, navigating treacherous terrain filled with what locals called potato holes, settled pockets of water that could easily trip and injure a worker. They endured relentless heat and clouds of mosquitoes, often working chest-deep in swamp water to harvest the timber. Despite these deplorable conditions and periodic attacks from Spanish forces trying to reclaim sovereignty over the area, the British settlement persisted.
This period set the stage for a unique cultural and political evolution, as these rugged logwood cutters laid the foundations for what would eventually become a British colony on the edge of the Spanish Empire.
As the Maya cities were abandoned and the jungle reclaimed the stone temples, a new chapter of Belizean history began along the coast. In the early 1600s, the Caribbean Sea was a place of high-stakes conflict. While Spanish treasure ships moved gold and silver back to Europe, they were often trailed by privateers and buccaneers looking for a piece of the wealth. These sailors needed places to hide, refit their ships, and wait for their targets, and the rugged, reef-filled coastline of what we now call Belize provided the perfect refuge. By 1638, a group of shipwrecked British sailors established the first recorded European settlement, marking the beginning of a permanent British presence in the region. These settlers became known as the Baymen. The Baymen eventually shifted their focus from plundering Spanish ships to exploiting a valuable natural resource, logwood. Known as palo de tinte, this wood was highly prized in Europe because it produced a versatile dye used in the textile industry. Depending on the process, it could create shades of red, dark maroon, and deep purple. Extracting logwood was not for the faint of heart. The Baymen worked in grueling, often deplorable conditions deep within the swamps and mangroves. They dealt with potato holes, hidden pockets of deep water that could snap a leg, and thick mud that made every step a struggle. Beyond the physical labor, they faced a constant onslaught of mosquitoes and tropical bacteria that could eat away at the skin. Despite these hardships, the industry flourished, and as logwood prices eventually dipped, the settlers transitioned to the even more labor-intensive mahogany trade.
Throughout the 1700s, the Baymen lived in a state of constant uncertainty. Great Britain provided minimal support to the settlement, while Spain claimed total sovereignty over the land. The Spanish frequently launched hit-and-run attacks to intimidate the settlers and reclaim the territory, but they rarely stayed long enough to establish their own towns, largely because they detested the harsh, swampy environment. This tension finally reached a breaking point in 1798. Spain and Britain were at war, and the Spanish saw an opportunity to finally expel the Baymen once and for all. The pivotal moment occurred at St. George's Quay, a small island that served as the first capital of the settlement. On September 10, 1798, a massive Spanish fleet arrived to confront a much smaller group of Baymen who were supported by a few British forces. On paper, the Spanish had a clear advantage in numbers and firepower, but the Baymen had a secret weapon, their intimate knowledge of the coast. They knew the treacherous reefs and the shallow, winding channels that could rip the hull off a heavy Spanish warship. Legend suggests the Spanish were also weakened by sickness, and after a short but decisive engagement, they retreated. While the territory technically remained in Spanish hands on the diplomatic stage for years to come, Spain never again attempted to take control of the settlement. Today, the Battle of St. George's Quay is celebrated every September 10th as a national holiday, serving as a symbol of the resilience and independence that would eventually define the nation of Belize. As we move into the 19th century, the demographic landscape of Belize underwent a profound transformation, moving beyond a simple settlement of British loggers and enslaved Africans to become a complex tapestry of cultures. This period of peopling began in earnest with the arrival of the Garifuna people. Emerging from a history of intense European persecution in St. Vincent and Dominica, the Garifuna were forced to migrate to the Bay Islands and along the coasts of Central America during the late 1700s. By 1802, the first recorded group of approximately 150 Garifuna had established roots in Stan Creek, marking the beginning of their enduring presence in the region. However, the most significant influx occurred on November 19, 1832. Fleeing the violence and instability of civil warfare in Honduras, a massive wave of Garifuna arrived on the shores of southern Belize.
This event is so foundational to the identity of the nation that it is commemorated every year as Garifuna Settlement Day, a major national holiday.
Despite their resilience and rich cultural contributions, the British colonial government initially viewed the Garifuna with a degree of suspicion and control. They were largely confined to the southern regions through a strict visitation ticketing procedure. This system functioned much like a modern visa. Garifuna individuals were required to obtain a ticket just to enter Belize town, and they faced the threat of immediate imprisonment if they were caught staying beyond their allotted time. This restrictive policy highlights the systemic challenges and racial barriers faced by these new arrivals as they navigated a society that was still deeply divided. While the South was being shaped by the Garifuna, the northern and western districts were being transformed by the fallout of the caste war of Yucatan, known in Spanish as the Guerra de las Castas. This was a brutal and prolonged conflict that broke out in the late 1840s, where the indigenous Maya people rose up against the Spanish elite who had long controlled their land and labor. As the war raged for several decades, thousands of Maya and Mestizo refugees, people of mixed Spanish and Maya descent, fled across the Rio Hondo into the safety of British territory to escape the bloodshed. Between 1847 and 1857, these migrations heavily populated areas that we now know as Corozal and Orange Walk, as well as western communities like Benque Viejo del Carmen, Sucots, and San Ignacio. These new residents brought with them a deep knowledge of agriculture, particularly sugar cultivation, and new linguistic traditions that fundamentally altered the economy and social fabric of the colony. It is important to remember that this influx occurred shortly after the official end of slavery in 1834. Although slavery had technically been abolished, the socio-economic reality remained grim for many. A small group of wealthy white landowners still controlled the vast majority of the land and resources, while the predominantly black workforce and the newly arrived migrant groups often lived in deplorable conditions. They remained caught in a struggle for true autonomy within a system designed to maintain a rigid class structure. This era of migration did more than just increase the census numbers. It established the multicultural foundations and the diverse ethnic mosaic that defines modern Belizean society today. Belize's path to modern governance began with a simple, albeit limited form of democracy known as the public meeting. In the early days of the settlement, long before formal colonial status, the inhabitants governed themselves by gathering to discuss and vote on local affairs. While this represented an early democratic spirit, it was far from inclusive. These meetings were the domain of wealthy white landowners, specifically the baymen, while women and the growing population of black workers were excluded from the decision-making process. As the British government sought more formal oversight, they began appointing a superintendent to manage the settlement's affairs. This representative was typically sent from Jamaica, reflecting the interconnected nature of British interests in the Caribbean at the time. A major turning point occurred in 1853 when the informal public meeting system was replaced by a more structured legislative assembly. This transition paved the way for the settlement to officially become a British colony. In 1862, the territory was formally named the Colony of British Honduras. By 1871, the system evolved again into a crown colony government. Under this arrangement, a legislative council was established, and the territory was overseen by a lieutenant governor. Initially, the administration remained tied to Jamaica, but this administrative link was eventually severed in 1884. At that point, British Honduras began to be governed by its own dedicated governor, marking a significant step toward a distinct national identity. However, the internal social landscape remained deeply divided.
Even after slavery officially ended in 1834, the conditions for many workers remained deplorable. Power and land ownership were concentrated in the hands of a small elite, while the majority of the population lived in poverty. This tension boiled over in 1919, following the end of World War I, when severe riots broke out in Belize City. These riots were a catalyst for change, fueled by a rising black consciousness and the influence of leaders like Marcus Garvey. It was the spark of a long march toward independence, as people began to demand more rights and a voice in their own future.
The push for true democracy reached a milestone in 1954 with the introduction of universal adult suffrage. For the first time, all adults in Belize were granted the right to vote, regardless of their race or social status. This paved the way for local leaders to challenge the Crown's authority. 10 years later, in 1964, the colony achieved self-government. This era saw the establishment of a National Assembly consisting of a Senate and a House of Representatives. Central to this movement was George Price, often called the Father of the Nation.
Known for his humble leadership, Price traveled across the country to visit every village, often by foot or horse, advocating for the rights of the people. His leadership helped transition the country from a colony managed by distant officials to a nation governed by its own citizens.
To truly understand modern Belize, we have to look at one of its most complex challenges, the long-standing territorial dispute with Guatemala. This isn't just a political disagreement. It's a saga that dates back to the days when Spain claimed sovereignty over the region, while British settlers were busy cutting logwood and mahogany. When Guatemala gained independence from Spain in 1821, they asserted that they had inherited all the lands Spain previously held, under a legal principle known as uti possidetis.
This essentially meant that the new nation believed its borders should match the old colonial ones. However, the British had been established in Belize for centuries, creating a clash of claims that led to the pivotal Treaty of 1859. This treaty was intended to settle the matter once and for all. The most famous part of this agreement is Article 7, which stated that in exchange for Guatemala dropping its claim to the territory, Great Britain would build a road from Guatemala City to the Atlantic coast.
This road was vital for trade, but as history shows, it was never constructed. For over 150 years, this unfulfilled promise has been the core of Guatemala's argument for reclaiming Belizean territory. While Guatemala blamed the British for the failure, historical evidence suggests that Britain was actually prepared to move forward with the construction. However, because Guatemala was at war with El Salvador at the time, they were unable to ratify the necessary agreements. Some historical accounts even suggest that cash was offered as a substitute for the road, but the funds vanished into the political landscape of the era.
As the decades passed, this dispute became a major obstacle to Belize's path toward sovereignty. In the 1970s, tensions reached a boiling point with credible threats of a Guatemalan invasion. The fear among the population was genuine. People in border towns like Bullet Tree and Benque began selling their livestock and belongings for pennies on the dollar, anticipating they would have to flee. In response, the British deployed Harrier supersonic jets to patrol the skies. These advanced planes served as a military deterrent, flying over the border as a show of force that ultimately prevented an armed conflict.
While the name of the colony was changed from British Honduras to Belize in 1973, the ongoing threat from the West delayed full independence until 1981. Since then, the two nations have transitioned from military tension to diplomatic negotiations. High-level talks were eventually held at the Organization of American States in Washington, D.C., and today the matter sits before the International Court of Justice, or ICJ. This international body is now tasked with providing a final, legally binding ruling on the border. While the issue remains sensitive, the move to the ICJ represents a significant step toward a peaceful, legal resolution that respects the sovereignty of the Belizean people.
The journey to Belizean independence is a story of resilience, transitioning from centuries of colonial rule to a modern, sovereign democracy. This path became clear in the mid-20th century, starting with a significant shift in the 1950s. A landmark moment occurred in 1954 with the introduction of universal adult suffrage, which granted every adult the legal right to vote for the first time. This empowered the local population and set the stage for constitutional evolution. By 1964, the settlement achieved self-government, establishing a National Assembly comprised of a Senate and a House of Representatives.
At this stage, while still a colony, the local people finally began to manage their own internal affairs. Central to this era was the leadership of George Price, often referred to as the Father of the Nation. Price was a man of the people, known for his incredible humility and dedication. He famously visited every village across the country, often traveling by foot, horse, or canoe to reach the most remote communities.
His commitment to the cause was so fierce that he even spent time in prison for treason after a defiant act involving the Queen's portrait.
Alongside him in the history books is Philip Goldson, the leader of the opposition. Despite their political differences, Goldson was deeply respected for his role in balancing democracy. Today, both men are honored on the national currency as symbols of the country's foundation. In 1973, a major symbolic step was taken when the name of the colony was officially changed from British Honduras to Belize. While many hoped independence would follow immediately, the process was delayed by a long-standing territorial dispute with Guatemala. During the 1970s, tensions escalated to the point where an invasion seemed imminent. In a show of support, Britain deployed supersonic Harrier jets to patrol the skies, a move that successfully deterred the threat. Finally, on September 21, 1981, Belize achieved full independence, remaining a proud member of the Commonwealth. Since that historic day, Belizean politics has been defined by a stable two-party system, featuring the People's United Party and the United Democratic Party. While several minor parties exist, these two giants have shaped the nation's growth through regular elections every 5 years.
To unite this diverse new nation, several national symbols were established to reflect its unique heritage. The flag prominently features the coat of arms, bearing the motto, Sub Umbra Floreo, which means, under the shade I flourish. This motto pays homage to the mahogany industry that once drove the economy. The mahogany tree itself is the national tree, paired with the exotic black orchid as the national flower. The keel-billed toucan, known for its vibrant colors, serves as the national bird, while the tapir, or mountain cow, is recognized as the national animal.
Together, these symbols and the history of the late 20th century represent a nation that is both proud of its roots and optimistic about its sovereign future.